This week, the agenda asked, why no inquiry? We followed the fight for greater LGBT rights and turned over a familiar business trope. The agenda's Week in Review begins, though, with the province putting its own policy first. I remember Stephen Harper doing an event, I think this is probably 2 elections ago, at Yonge and Bloor at the Toronto Reference Library.
That's right.
And the questions from the media were all, why do you hate Toronto so much? And he said, I'm here at Yonge and Bloor in the heart of Toronto, giving away millions of dollars to help rebuild this library. How can you say I hate Toronto?
Exactly. And look, they look at it from different guises. They used to say that about Mike Harris as well, because a lot of his MPPs weren't from Toronto, that the focus all became on Northern Ontario or various other areas, wherever their power base is. But naturally, no matter who it is, be it a prime minister or a premier, they're obviously going to emphasize whatever region votes for them the most. That's understandable, because why would you outreach to Toronto if Toronto is going to reject you at the polls? But at the same time, I think there's one little thing I just wanted to throw into the mix as well, which I think we're missing about Ontario. What I think is actually happening is I don't think there is actually a lot of communication and collectivism sort of working here any longer, in the sense that Ontario is not leading the way as much as it used to in terms of the ministers or the premiers in terms of getting ideas across. I think what you're actually seeing is a switch. For example, the Western premiers have all just signed what would be a mutually beneficial free trade agreement. It's something that they can work in their favor. And one of the reasons I think they're doing it a lot more now is I think they realize that Ontario is a have-not province. They don't have the power base they had before. Ergo, why should they lead the way? We have initiatives. We have good ideas. Well, it's not a surprise. I
was just going to say, I want to find out from the think tank guy whose job it is to come up with ideas for politicians to champion, whether you sign on to that.
No, and so let me bring 2 issues together here. I don't know whether tactically the federal government's and Stephen Harper or Joe Oliver's attacks on Ontario are good politics or not, and we'll see how that plays out. But I do find it scandalous, and I think it is clearly part of the strategy. It is clearly part of the strategy of the federal government to want to wash its hands of any blame around the state of the Ontario economy, and there is a very integrated agenda, I think, amongst right-wing think tanks, the federal government, to say all of the problems in Ontario, they're not about globalization or big structural changes that they really are about. They're just about the Liberals, the profligate Liberals, the bad Liberal government, and that is completely absolving themselves of responsibility for, I'm not saying it's all Stephen Harper's fault, it's obviously not Stephen Harper's fault. There's huge things going on in the Ontario economy, but you need governments that get together and collaborate and want to work together to try and align some of their initiatives and policies. And regardless of what you think of Stephen Harper, if you vote for him or you don't, he's not really a collaborator. He doesn't bring people around the table who he disagrees with and you all try and figure out how we can partner to make this better. And I think that is 100% what Ontario needs. And I would say that part of this, with respect, Michael, is to keep calling Ontario a have-not province. First of all,
they are, Matthew. There's nothing you can do about it.
It's
not the Fraser Institute and the C.D. Howe Institute saying it. It's everyone is saying it. We don't have a power base anymore. It doesn't exist.
Hold on. Let's talk about what is your definition of have-not? So you keep saying, what is your definition? You said it is a have-not by definition. What is your definition?
Basically, Ontario is using its taxes to prop itself up. That's what basically
we are doing.
What is your
definition of have-not? So we can have this conversation. You said it clearly is.
Have are the ones who are actually have successful economies and are doing well. The have-nots are the ones who actually need the transfer payments and various taxes to survive.
Okay, so let me be specific about this.
Thank you, Matthew, but I've written on this for many years.
So let me be specific about this. Ontario, like Alberta and British Columbia, is one of 3 provinces that sends more money to other regions than receives back. So Saskatchewan gets more than it puts in, Quebec gets more, the Maritimes get more, Newfoundland gets more, Manitoba gets more. There are 3 provinces that contribute more financially than they get back. So if that's the definition of have or have not, Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario are the net contributors to the Federation. Look, there are lots of problems in the Ontario economy. There are lots of problems in the global economy, but we have economic growth, we have job creation, there are real issues, but to think that these are the fault of the Ontario government, I do think is a strategy of the federal government to absolve itself of responsibility.
Can you just clarify this? Because there was a big deal made when Ontario got equalization payments for the first time several years ago, and therefore became, as Michael says, technically a have-not province. Exactly. Is that not accurate?
It receives equalization. I don't use the terms have and have not. I think they're very misleading, but Ontario does receive equalization. So Ontario will receive last year like $2 billion, but they contribute about $7 billion in. So you're making a contribution of $7 billion and getting $2 billion. That other $5 billion is being redistributed elsewhere.
I get this unlevel playing field, and I know Conservatives have often said to me, this is not fair. Unions go out, they spend all this money, they defeat our candidates, and then they're in negotiations with the provincial government who feel indebted to them because they spend so much on their behalf, therefore they're going to get what they want. But unions will simply say the same thing about business as well. The business will go out there and spend a ton of money to get a pro-business party in, and the pro-business party will cut their taxes and they'll get what they want. Right. So how is this an unlevel playing field in that regard?
Well, it's not happening. And they're right. They can go out and do that. And the point is here is that that's not right either. We need to make sure that there's an equal playing field so that when corporations, just if a group of corporations or a group of interests, could be any interest, decide they want to support another party, whether it's the NDP or the Conservative Party or the Green Party, have the same set of rules as each one of those parties and as, say the Working Family Coalition does. Let's have an equal playing field. We started down this road and we actually got to a point where it's only half measures, right? I don't think anyone foresaw what would happen, and that the Working Families Coalition would be as effective as they've been with their organization. They have, and kudos to them. They've done a great job at getting their message across.
You don't mean kudos to them. You're mad at them.
Well, hey, I respect what they've done. I respect what they've done, in so much as they've played within the rules, and they've been very effective at getting their message out. The fact is, it's almost insurmountable, and they've got to a point where they're almost, it starts to almost beg collusion with the Liberal Party. I mean, now to the point where the Liberal Party depends so much, I think, on that relationship with them and the Working Families Coalition that, at what point does it become, they're in collusion with one another, or even begs corruption. I'm not suggesting they are corrupt, but, it begs that, to happen. It opens that door because, geez, they don't want to lose that support, right?
The last Conservative who accused a Liberal of corruption ended up getting sued. I think Kathleen Wynne is still suing Tim Hudak for that one.
Yeah.
So you're not alleging corruption.
No, I'm not alleging corruption. Okay. I'm just saying it opens the door for things like corruption and collusion between political parties and third parties.
I can still, Rod, I hear what you're saying, but I can still see people at home watching this saying, you know what, if he'd managed to get a similarly large number of third-party actors involved on behalf of his campaign instead of in opposition to his campaign, and he'd ended up winning, he'd have thought that was just ducky.
It doesn't make it right. I mean, would I like to have won? Sure, but that's not the point. The point is that it's not a fair playing field. And, we've started down this path of traditional egalitarianism in Canada, where the federal government, even it was challenged, even I think it was Harper v. Canada, where Harper wanted to limit what third parties could spend in a campaign. It was shot down by the Supreme Court and then actually upheld again because there's a reference in the Charter of Freedoms of balance, to make sure there's a balance there. So if you're going to limit one party, i.e. a political party, you have to impose the same limits on any other third party, whether it's a corporation or a union.
Should there be rules saying if you're a member of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, you can only spend on an election campaign what the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario spends as well?
I think that's a great place to start, sure.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Why not? We have limitations and we have to be accountable to the voting public, and they have to know exactly where our money's coming from and how much of it is spent where. Why shouldn't other parties who have political interest have the same rules?
Okay, but if you're also right that we have potentially here an unhealthy situation in Ontario where unions have helped get the government elected, the government now has a majority, they will be there for 4 years, how is it possibly in their interest to, in some respects, unilaterally disarm by giving you the even playing field that you want?
Yeah, that's the problem we run into, right? Why would they shoot themselves in the foot? I mean, they've benefited very heavily from this, which is part of the reason I wrote this paper with my co-author, Jane Kovarkova, on exactly why this isn't right. And when you start to look at other provinces, i.e. Manitoba, Alberta, BC, Quebec, I think Nova Scotia, and some other jurisdictions with Westminster systems have actually imposed different types of limitations on third parties. The reason they've done this, and the reason the OECD has recommended that this sort of limitation happens, is to reduce the influence and to make sure that the pluralism of our system is equal. Everyone's on an equal playing field. It's important that these groups have a voice.
Thomas did mention several minutes ago this Royal Commission into Aboriginal peoples that I think Brian Mulrooney called, was it the late 80s or early 90s? Late 80s, I think he called it.
It started in about 1990, I believe.
Was okay.
The Oka crisis.
Yeah.
Right. Here's a few of the recommendations that came out of it. We'll just pull some of these highlights out and then discuss this. What Aboriginal people need is straightforward, if not simple, says this graphic. Control over their lives in place of well-meaning but ruinous paternalism of past Canadian governments. Lands, resources, and self-chosen governments with which to reconstruct social, economic, and political order. Time, space, and respect from Canada to heal their spirits and revitalize their cultures. All of that coming out of this report, which came out in 1996. And Glenn, I mean, among the many questions that it raises is, Indigenous people, if I understand this, want to be seen as an equal nation to Canada in their negotiations with Canada. They want to have, quote-unquote, nation-to-nation negotiations. Is that an impediment to getting things done?
I think more importantly is the opportunity that's presented to communities to step away from the paternalism of the Indian Act, to work with other like-minded individuals or corporations that want to develop resources in their territories, to lead them away from dependency on government. And we're seeing that in many jurisdictions right across Canada, where companies are working very well with communities to build whether mines or hydroelectric projects. We saw that in northern Quebec, we see that in northern Saskatchewan, the territories, northern Ontario, in the Ring of Fire. We're seeing that communities really want to take a step forward and participate in the economy, the local economy. It's not the only opportunities, but it's a piece of a larger puzzle that will lead to more active jobs, more meaningful jobs, better pay, and maybe distraction from those issues of poverty that are faced with communities right now, because there isn't sufficient funding coming from government. So
let me get follow-up from Michelle on this. Do you think the need to be seen to be partaking in nation-to-nation talks or negotiations is an impediment to progress here?
It is, and we have to be frank also that within our own nations, women has or need to take a place. And in order to do that, right now, because we don't have the capacity with the financial aspect, any government, could be our own or the federal and provincial government, to support the women's group in order to be ready to compete, to be at those table and making sure that they're part of that change or this economy. And it's not the case. And if we want to see that change, women are living in poverty. And the majority of the women that we saw on the numbers that you present for the RCMP, missing and murdered women and young girls, were living in extreme poverty. I don't want to say they were prostitutes, but their condition of life were very, very sad compared to Canadian women. So for me, nation to nation, but needs to include Aboriginal women also.
Apropos, Charlie, of what you were saying a few moments ago, Tina Fontaine was a photogenic young woman, let's put it that way. I mean, she made her story, unlike so many of the others, made the front pages of all the papers. In a bizarre kind of a way, does that present a better opportunity now, some momentum, if you like, to make some progress on this?
Well, I think what should come out of any tragedy is momentum. And going back to Ipperwash was a tragic moment in Ontario history. You know, it destroyed, took the life of Dudley George. For the Ontario Provincial Police, it was also traumatic. Out of that came recommendations that changed things. And I will say, in the 14 years that I've been involved in dealing with frontline issues in Aboriginal communities and with police, the transformation in police culture out of that has been extraordinary. The OPP, and you see with Idle No More, how the OPP and RCMP handled it. They learned those lessons. So I think Tina Fontaine, her death should not be in vain. It is such an awful tragedy that Canadians of all stripes are saying, let's do something here. So what is that solution? I don't know. But I know that when you look at the issues, if you start to deal with the issues of the child welfare institutions, the underfunding, the lack of support in home environments, so that a young woman like her gets broken off from her family, ends up on the street. You know, these aren't natural occurrences. This is what happens when you don't have systems in place. We have systems in place in non-Aboriginal communities to protect children at risk. It's not the same situation. So let's not make her the poster child for this, but let's say there is a moment, and if it's not her, as this whole new campaign, who will be next? Well, there is momentum coming here, and it is going to happen, that this inquiry will come.
I can tell, Catherine, the way Charlie said it, the notion of a poster girl is a tough way to put it, but often that's how you get change, when somebody captures the imagination of the public. Is this one of those moments, potentially?
It is. It was partly because of Tina's appeal, which leaps off the page, and I don't think it goes beyond physical. You know, she had a sparkle to her. The chief of police in Winnipeg put it at the forefront and properly and showed some real leadership, and that's what's necessary here. And characterizing this as a horrific crime that most Canadians wouldn't tolerate. About a bag of puppies or kittens, so that we should all be horrified. In our communities and our families, we're already horrified. We all know we all know, and we all know the heightened risks that our children and that we face as Indigenous women. But for that man, for the chief of police in Winnipeg to step forward and characterize it in a way that non-Indigenous Canadians could really appreciate, I think that had tremendous value as well.
Glenn, you wanted to add?
Well, I guess I was a follow-up on something that Charlie said, that you know, we need strong leadership today, and whether it's you know, from the Government of Canada or the provinces or from our own leadership in our communities. You know, we were self-sustaining at some point in the past. We looked after our own people, and today we've lost that ability. In many circumstances, we don't start with strong families, and we don't have strong communities to support or to point out what's not right. And I think we need to change that. And I think by empowering all of our people, and you know, it's not just women that are affected by violence in Aboriginal communities, it's men. And as Tom pointed out, that you know, we have this these circumstances that lead to this type of violence that doesn't do anyone any good. And where do we start? I go back to how we can develop some sort of plan that helps communities foster better relations amongst themselves and work towards stopping that kind of action.
Graham, because in Canada there is same-sex marriage that is legal, and in some American states as well.
19, yeah.
19 out of 50? Okay. Has that only changed things for the better for people in the LGBTI? Do I add a Q on the end as well?
Sure.
Q communities.
Look, there's been enormous progress, and marriage does represent an achievement of equality. There is sometimes a reaction against marriage equality. We see in the name of the law in Nigeria is the same-sex marriage prohibition bill. A lot of the arguments that are used against basic equal rights for LGBT people is a pushback against marriage equality. So we see a reaction against the achievements and the gains that are made in some parts of the world in other parts of the world. And just for the record, I should add Sudan, northern Nigeria, and parts of Somalia as countries that still retain the death penalty for same-sex practices.
So it's more than 5 then?
Well, 5 and 2 parts of Somalia and Nigeria, not the whole country, just sections of
Understood.
the country.
Do you, Fred, think that, to what extent does legal discrimination against LGBTIQ people in Canada still exist?
Well, it's there. I mean, look, the
legal discrimination, I'm saying.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by legal discrimination.
Housing, employment.
Look, there's going to be some of it because there's going to be some people who lag behind their own personal, their personal views on tolerance of gay people. There's always going to be some people, and that's really, really unfortunate. So there's some of that, but it's going away. It's going away massively. I mean, amazing changes since I was growing up and coming out of the closet back in the 70s and 80s. So we made amazing changes to Canada. It's lovely.
How difficult do you think it is for people in this country?
It's difficult when you talk about issues surrounding intersectionality. If you're a white, upper middle class gay man, you're probably going to have an okay time in Canada. If you're a person of color, if you're trans, if you're a sex worker, if you're HIV positive, if you're born into poverty, all of these different elements, as they intersect on top of one another, make it extremely difficult to find employment, to find a home in some cases, and you experience discrimination and marginalization in everyday life. And so we have to always think about how different people experience that discrimination, even in a wonderful place like Toronto.
Let me ask Sarah about that. You told us earlier in the program about how you, as a woman of color from an African country, are having occasionally a tough time of it here. Do you notice, though, as Andrea puts it, upper middle class white males who don't have so tough a time here?
Yes.
You do see that?
Yes, I do see that.
How do you see that? How does it manifest itself?
Because you're born here and because you're in the upper class, you're much better off. You're the untouched. But for the person like me, the newcomer, the refugee, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. You're not able to access so much. You're not able to. You don't have a say. You're just here because you're protected by Canada, but that's it. But I know people who are even taken back home, they're deported back home because they're not able to prove that they're homosexuals or they're gays.
That would be a challenging thing to prove. How do they expect you to prove that?
Yes,
kind of
you're
thing?
expected to prove that you're gay.
Yeah.
You come here as a newcomer, you go through your refugee process, and you're expected to bring in documents that prove that you're gay.
How documents? Like what possibly could you present that would prove that you're gay?
Say, pictures that suggest, or letters from relatives, from maybe the police, from whoever.
I see. Maurice, does this ring true for you?
Well, thankfully, I didn't have to go through that process. I chose to come to Canada. I had to flee Jamaica temporarily when my marriage to my husband became known in the country. But I determined to continue going back to Jamaica, and I continued to go back to Jamaica to do my work there as a lawyer, challenging the anti-sodomy laws. But I never had to go through the refugee process. But from what I've heard, I've had to do some testimonies on behalf of people who are seeking refugee status. It is a very harrowing experience to prove your orientation. You know, you have to prove intimate details, and depending on the judge you get, it can get very graphic. You know, not everybody can meet the standard. So thankfully, I didn't have to do it, but I really feel the pain of those who have to do it.
I've actually done stories, news stories about newcomers who are actually asked to produce porn, gay porn, to prove that they're gay. And these are people, obviously, as Sarah says, these are people who spend their entire lives hiding the fact they're gay. They're not going to travel with gay porn. It's ridiculous, and it's dehumanizing, frankly.
When you're in Jamaica, and you talk to people down there, what do they think of what's happening in Canada vis-a-vis LGBTIQ rights?
You know, Jamaica is a wonderful country. We have a very diverse set of people. There are some who celebrate the advances and wish Jamaica would catch up. But sadly, the vast majority, the last time we did a survey at the university, over 80% of the country self-identified as homophobic. And so the advances
80% say we're homophobic?
Yes, they self-identify as homophobic.
To a public opinion survey, for example?
Yes, it was a survey which was a very rigorous survey done by the most prominent university in the region, University of the West Indies. And we did it year on year, and it's the same result, you know, and it's across all spectra. It's, you know, doesn't matter socioeconomic status, doesn't matter education levels, right across. Because we have a very fundamentalist religious environment which still believes that being gay is an abomination.
Fred, I gotta ask you this follow-up, because one of the things that did astonish me about the Stephen Fry documentary was how many so-called homophobic people are prepared to go on television and kind of tell everybody how much they hate gay people. Why does somebody do that?
Well, because to them, they see that as perfectly normal. I mean, that's their worldview is correct as they see it, and so they're proud. I would say they're proud of what they believe in. So there's no shame. It's like, hey, I want to tell the world I believe this. It's right. So bring on the cameras. I'm okay with it.
You wanted to make another point.
I have to say I disagree on this. I think white males face a really big problem in Canada right now. The university.
White gay males?
Well, white males in general. I mean, because 60 to 65% of the college population are female. You've got hiring practices in the federal government and large corporations that favor people of color, women, Aboriginals, people with disability. It's hard for white males. There's some problems there.
Okay, no, Andrea, we're going to be respectful of everybody's views around the table.
This is the problem, is that people don't take this issue seriously.
I suspect, she can speak for herself, but I suspect the laugh came from the notion that people with disabilities, people with color, don't see themselves as having that great a deal in the country compared to white men.
But I didn't say that. I mean, what I'm saying here is that the facts are clear right now in university. We're heading for a disaster. We've got 60 to 65% of university population is female. The men aren't going to university. This is going to be a disaster in the future. It's a whole other show, but this is a big, very, very big issue.
I should be taking notes on this because so far we've got 3 ideas for 3 other programs that, we're going to do more. It is a common narrative. The private sector is filled with risk-loving venture capitalists, in contrast to the public sector, replete with its risk-averse bureaucracy. But our next guest sees a world where the public sector is the one taking the risks while the private sector leans back and reaps the rewards. Joining us now with more, here's Mariana Mazzucato. She is an economist and author of The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, and we are happy to welcome you here to our studios at TVO.
Thank you.
Where does that narrative come from in the first place, that all the risk takers and sharpies are in the private sector and all the leeches and risk-averse people are in the public sector?
Well, first of all, I think that there's 2 reasons we have that narrative, and then historically it has evolved in different ways. The first reason is that there's massive profits to be made from that narrative. It was actually the National Venture Capital Association that in 1976 in the US started to lobby hard for capital gains tax to fall. They were formed in 1976 as an association, and already in 1981, capital gains tax had fallen by 50%, from 40% to 20%.
So they did their job.
They did their job, and the problem is that we have no evidence economically, especially from people like myself that actually do sector-level analysis, that that kind of a tax reduction actually stimulates investment. Because what drives business investment is really the perception about where the future technological and market opportunities are. And Warren Buffett himself is famous for having said that, tax has never affected where he invests, let alone innovation investments, sort of R&D, research and development. You don't just spend on it because it's cheap to do so, because someone's reduced your tax. You spend because you think there's a big opportunity. But the other thing is, I think that since the 70s, and really, I'd say early 80s with the whole Thatcher and Reagan attack on the state, the narrative around that in order to actually reduce the size of the state has been very much one that we're doing it in order to make the economy more competitive, more innovative. Of course, today the narrative is about cutting, budget deficits because of what happened after the crisis, with public debt having to rise so much in order to bail out the banks and the private sector. But this narrative really does date back to the 80s, and it's been part and parcel of this attempt to reduce the state, with the idea that by doing so, you will release all this sort of dynamism. And so what I've tried to do is actually to look at those countries and those regions within countries where you have had that kind of innovation-led growth, and what role did the state play? Did it just have to get out of the way, and did the private sector then kind of do its thing, or something else? And the answer is something else.
Something else. I was going to say, I infer from the way you've just laid that out that you're not exactly on side with that narrative.
Yeah. So basically what I found in places like Silicon Valley, but I would argue in places like China today, Finland, Denmark, Germany, Brazil, is that the private sector really only enters these difficult spaces, because don't forget, innovation is really difficult. Most of it fails. Most R&D projects fail. It is really uncertain, not just risky. It is exposed to what Frank Knight, a famous economist in the 1920s, talked about in terms of fundamental uncertainty. We just don't know. And so the private sector, which is risk averse in general, but especially around innovation, they are not willing to absorb that kind of level of uncertainty. So in biotechnology, venture capitalists only entered about 20 years after the state made the leading investments around the underlying knowledge base. We've seen this with nanotechnology, with the internet, and we're witnessing it today with clean technology.
The state lays out the path, and then
lays
the private
out the
sector
paths, but what's interesting is that, I'm an economist, and economists, when they want to talk about the role of the state in this process, at best talk about the state in funding things like basic research, which is understood to be a public good with very high spillovers. It's hard to appropriate the profits from that, and so people more or less agree that, okay, fine, the state has to fund the big science. But the reality is that with all the general purpose technologies, these are the big innovations, like whether it was the internet, nuclear power, mass production, and we're hoping today different technologies around green technology. The state didn't just fund the basic research, it actually funded most of the whole innovation chain, including applied research and early stage seed funding for actual companies. So in the US, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, funded by the US government, has funded more companies than the entire private venture capital industry. Apple, Compaq, and Intel all got loans and grants from that fund. And what we don't realize then is that, even today, say with Tesla, which is the new hero in Silicon Valley, Elon Musk.
Battery-powered car.
Yeah. Tesla received a $500 million guaranteed loan from Obama, making billions today, this particular initiative. Solyndra received the same amount. And everyone knows about Solyndra because it went bust.
Belly up and was a huge embarrassment for Obama.
Exactly, but this is the problem, that if the state does take the sort of lead role, which it has taken, again, it funded the internet, it funded all the technologies behind the iPhone, everything that makes the iPhone smart, internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri, all government funded. All those technologies were in fact picked, as many companies have been picked. And the point is that just like with private venture capital, you win some, you lose some, right? No. But the problem is that because we don't admit the state plays this role, we haven't allowed the state to reap back the rewards from the successes. So Tesla was a success. Solyndra wasn't. If we had allowed some of the profits that were generated then from Tesla or from Apple or from Google, Google's algorithm was funded by the NSF, National Science Foundation, to come back to the state, it could also then fund the losses, the Solyndras, as well as the next round.
In whose interest is it to continue that narrative that the private sector gets the credit whenever something great based on public research happens, but the public sector has to carry the can for the fact that anything might fail?
Right. Well, first of all, I summarize that problem as socialization of risk, privatization of reward, which is interesting because people have used that sentence to describe what went wrong with the banking system, right? We allowed the banks to make the profits in good times. When things go bad, the state has to come in and bail them out. But I often argue that's exactly what I see in the innovation economy. And I think that in the long run, no one benefits, because in the long run, that dynamic, which is a dysfunctional dynamic, will hurt future innovation. It will hurt capitalism, which is based on innovation, unlike feudalism that for 500 years had no innovation, it was inertial. But in the short run, as I was saying before, there are benefits to those who are propagating this line because, again, they can then portray the state as this meddler, an inertial dinosaur, bureaucratic, an impediment to innovation.
Where in fact, they don't get the first base without it.
Yeah, will argue for lower tax, lower regulation, which in the short run does increase profits.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety if you want to. They're all on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. They're on our iTunes channel and on our YouTube channel as well, and that's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.